In today's episode, we ask a question that I've had to ask far more times than I ever expected to. Did Bigfoot kidnap this child? I'm Aiden Madison, welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Since the very beginning, the Dennis Martin disappearance has been the subject of some controversy, with many people, including his father Bill Martin, believing that he was more likely kidnapped than just lost. While law enforcement has never agreed with this, the belief has still not gone away. And the theories about what happened to Dennis have only grown more out of the box as the years have gone by. Some have suggested that Dennis was kidnapped accidentally, and that the intended target was one of the sons of Carter Martin, who it appears was a relative of Bill Martin, and whose family was present at Spence Field that day. Others have looked to more conspiratorial angles, such as an abduction by the feral people said to inhabit the park, or by something else. One of those people is David Paulides, who can be credited with reviving the Dennis Martin story after he included it in his 2011 book, Missing 411 Eastern United States and Canada. The case was in the section of the book dedicated to the Great Smoky Mountains cluster, and if you've been watching our channel at all this summer, and if you're watching this video like a year or two in the future, and that's not my problem. Anyway, if you've been watching our channel a lot this summer, then you've probably noticed that we're covering a lot of these stories. And as I've been doing that, I've noticed that many of the segments in that book are rather short, averaging somewhere around 4 or 5 pages. The Dennis Martin entry, on the other hand, spans a total of 17. Towards the end of those 17 pages, which largely tell the same story that we did in part 1 of our Dennis Martin coverage, Paulides includes a bulleted list of things that happened before and after, during and after the search, I should say, asking readers to imagine you read a storyline like this. A little boy disappears in a meadow at a national park within 50 feet of his parents. Searchers scour the park for weeks with no results. 80 armed Green Beret special forces were brought into the park to search. Strange screams are reported by a family in the park. Something similar to a dark-figured man is seen running through the forest in the park carrying something over his shoulder. A psychic tells of seeing a boy in a cave-like setting. Another psychic tells of seeing a boy possibly in a tree. No trace of the boy was ever found. 11 people have disappeared under unusual circumstances at or near this park. To quickly go through the ones that we have covered 7. Of those 7, 3 were not in the park, and honestly, saying they were near the park is a bit of a stretch. They were generally in the same state as the park. And by that I mean that they were on the northern border of Tennessee and the southern border of North Carolina, while the Great Smoky Mountains are on the border between those two states. For those of you who aren't American, Tennessee is not south of North Carolina, they are next to each other. So we're talking about 2 different north-south locations. Of the 4 who were in the park, we were able to completely explain 2 of them, Jeff Haig and Mark Hansen. You can go to watch those videos if you want to know what happened. And then Trenny Gibson, it's a little hard to say exactly what happened. We have a theory, but we don't think that it was, paranormal. And as for Evangeline Lorimer, hers might have been supernatural, but it was in the sense that, well, you can watch the video to find out. But to get back to our bullet points, the 10th and final is the lead FBI agent on this case commits self-delete. I don't know how far we are into the video, and therefore I don't know which YouTube no-no words are off the table. Now, much of what David Paulides listed in these 10 points is factual, or at least close to it. But there are a few things included in his account that don't exactly mesh with what I was able to find while I reviewed the materials. And speaking of reviewing materials, I would like to review some materials for you. The materials inside this little device, my Fume. We've been working with Fume for a good long while now, at least a year I think at this point, and it's because we actually believe in their mission and we like what they do. When you order your journey pack from tryfume.com/lorelodge and use code lorelodge, you'll get one of these guys. And what's inside of this is 3 parts. You got your little wooden canister, got this little fiber flavoring stick, and then you have a metal mouthpiece. Now, you may be wondering what it is that Fume does. What is it for? Because right now, it just looks like a really fancy pen. But it's not just a really fancy pen. It's a really fancy pen that you can put in your mouth and suck on. Did you notice how no vapor came out? No smoke. Well, that's because there is no vapor and there is no smoke. Fume is purely flavored air. And the reason it exists is to help you break bad habits. And I think you know which bad habits I'm talking about. I know for me, a lot of my friends will enjoy engaging in some bad habits after a night of, different bad habits, but it's hard to get past the peer pressure sometimes, and that's what I use this guy for. It's super simple, works just by changing this little airflow dial to decide how much air you want to come through, and then you're good to go. You see, the whole idea behind fume is that getting rid of a bad habit is hard, but replacing the bad habit with a good habit, well, that can be easy, enjoyable, and even fun. And if you'd like to try replacing some of those bad habits with good habits yourself, you can go to tryfume.com/lorelodge or scan the QR code on your screen to get your journey pack, and if you get it using this promotion, well, you'll get a free topper. And that's just a little protective piece that goes up here to keep it nice and clean and shiny for you. Once again, that is tryfume.com/lorelodge or scan the QR code to get your journey pack with a free topper. I can't think of a transition back into the video.
Well, we're gonna need something.
Well, I mean, we can't just cut to black in the middle of a sentence. The first thing I'd like to address is the issue of the psychic tips, the psychic premonitions that came in during and after this search. The ones given by Paulides are the boy in a cave-like setting and a boy possibly in a tree, which are references to the tip sent in by Harold Sherman and the one that was passed along by Carson Brewer. We went over how psychics played into the search and how it was received and all of that in part 1, but I will give details about these two instances. The latter of the two is discussed briefly in the National Park Service chronological narrative of the search in a section reading, on June 26, Carson Brewer of the Knoxville News-Sentinel called and forwarded a suggestion received from a lady telling us to start looking in trees and treetops and stop looking on the ground. Paulides adds that there was no other explanation. You will read about a missing girl later in this book that disappeared and was found high in a tree. Coincidence? Regarding Sherman's contribution, David writes that on July 17, 1969, the National Park Service received a letter from the ESP Research Associates in Little Rock, Arkansas. Harold Sherman, the president of that organization, authored the letter. Paulides claims that this letter was in the pages of the documents sent from the FOIA request that he himself filed, specifically noting that the last 3 paragraphs of the letter are very discomforting. And I considered just giving you a summary, but I wanted to read you what Harold Sherman is supposed to have written. Aiden, at this point I need to request the mood lighting. Thank you. And now, a dramatic reading. I am impelled to ask you if you know whether or not there have been or are any questionable characters in this region, camping out in the wild in this area, like hermits, squatters. And such an individual may not be connected with the boy's disappearance at all, but I feel that a sex maniac, so-called, does exist in the vicinity and could have trailed the boy. I hesitate to write any more as my conscious mind is trying to reject such a feeling. I see something red and something being carried or dragged. Are there any caves in the vicinity? A stream may run through it, or even part of it. I am always tormented when impressions come to my conscious mind, trying to tell me that they can't possibly be true, but I get a sudden feeling of panic on the part of Dennis. What happened to him occurred suddenly, unexpectedly, and he could not, or did not, cry out. He seems to be struck down by something. The area is rugged. Anyway, Paulides finishes the section by reminding the reader that Dennis was wearing a red shirt, and there are mines in the area where Harold Key and his family made their observation. While both of those things are true, it's important to remember a few things about these predictions, and not just because they're from psychics. First, we'll look at Sherman's, because it's by far the more detailed and extensive of the two, with a few main points. Red, carrying or dragging, caves, not crying out, and of course the alleged sex maniac. I wouldn't joke if it weren't so utterly silly. As it turns out, Dennis was wearing a red shirt, there are certainly caves in the area, and it's true that nobody heard anything when the boy disappeared. And if someone did actually kidnap him, then a sex maniac carrying him off does seem like it's a possibility. All of these predictions would therefore be rather impressive, if they were actually predictions. However, as Paulides himself notes, this letter was sent in mid-July, a full month after Dennis disappeared. By that point, newspapers were already reporting that Dennis had been wearing a red shirt, that he disappeared suddenly, without a sound, and that the area was covered in streams as well as dotted with caves and mines. The only thing not mentioned in the papers was the alleged sex maniac, but Bill Martin made it quite clear that he thought his son was kidnapped. Looking back at the one submitted by Brewer, the only point Paulides made regarding that lead was that later in the book, he would talk about a woman who was also found in a tree, which I believe is a reference to Elsie Davis. We haven't done a deep dive on Elsie Davis's case yet, but Paulides writes that she was a 24-year-old church organist in Bethel, Maine, who disappeared on Sunday, July 30th, 1911, just after the morning service. Following this, he turns our attention to another article, which describes searchers finding a bed of pine boughs, asking how would Elsie have known to comfort herself in that manner? Regarding her difficulty in explaining the story, Paulides goes on to say that it's almost as though the missing are under some type of spell that eliminates memory and the ability to speak. I'll get into some of what he's doing here later in the video, but the important part is that the psychic readings don't exactly hold up to scrutiny. Saying there's a link here just because another psychic predicted someone be found in a tree half a century earlier in another town in another state is tenuous enough, but it's especially tenuous considering that Dennis Martin was not found in a tree. There's also the issue of the prediction in Elsie's case, as Paulides does not provide the name of the psychic or where he read of this premonition. And that bugged me enough that I actually decided to look into the case a little bit. As it turns out, Dave got quite a bit wrong about Elsie's story, including her age. She was 22, not 24. His claim that she played at the church that morning. In reality, she'd secured a sub in advance. And the nature of the psychic's claims, which, perhaps most important of all, did not include her being in a tree. In reality, the prediction, published in the Lewiston Sun-Journal issue for August 2nd, 1911, reads, "She left her house and went directly north for a long ways, then turned and went eastward. She'll be found today or tomorrow in an angle of the fence near Locke's Mills." You might notice that an angle of a fence is not a tree. To top it off, ads for psychics were placed in at least 2 main papers the day that prediction was published. And this isn't even taking into account the fact that Elsie did eventually explain what she could remember, which was reported as follows in the Bangor Daily News. She was able to remember starting for a short walk Sunday afternoon, but could recall nothing that occurred up to Thursday night beyond the fact that she thought she obtained some sleep on Wednesday night. Later, it is expected her memory may clear so that she may recall some of her experiences. As far as known, she had nothing to eat except blueberries and raspberries, which are fairly plentiful now. In addition to that, the Sun-Journal also reported that Elsie had a history of depression and suicidal ideation, though obviously not in such modern terms. It is said, the paper reads, that Miss Davis had been in a disconsolate mood for some time, and only a few days ago, she told a very close friend of hers that, "I have nothing to live for. Oh, I might as well be dead." This was not a new discovery, the paper adding, it is further said that once or twice before she has had similar despondent periods, so that her friends thought nothing serious would come of this attack. This is a textbook case of depression. With all of that in mind, it seems very unlikely that this psychic had done anything but read the paper, recognize the girl was probably in the woods, and fabricate a premonition based upon known information. The same can be said of Sherman, who waited an entire month to report his visions to the National Park Service. And that's if the letter David Paulides mentioned even existed. On that list I gave earlier in the video, points 4 and 5 were that strange screams are reported by a family in the park, and something similar to a dark-figured man is seen running through the forest in the park carrying something over his shoulder. We had Nick from the Missing Enigma on to talk about that story in last week's episode, but for our purposes, I'm going to quickly go over the version provided by David Paulides in his book, which begins with the following sentences. The NPS and FBI did conduct interviews on many peripheral issues associated with the disappearance of Dennis. One of the more interesting and unusual interviews was with Harold Key of Carthage, Tennessee. The interview he's talking about seems to have transpired when, according to Paulides, FBI agent Jim Reich intercepted Mr. Key and met him away from the park to have the debriefing. That debriefing was the result of something that Key had claimed to have seen, Paulides writing that the Keys were hiking near Rowan's Creek in the Sea Branch area when they heard an enormous, sickening scream. The newspaper, he says, stated that a few minutes later he saw a rough-looking man moving stealthily in the woods near where he had heard the scream. At the time, however, Key did not know the boy was missing until the next day, and at that point he contacted authorities. Later in this section of the book, Paulides includes some details of the account, explaining that the Keys were driving through the park on the afternoon that Dennis disappeared, and had parked the car along the side of the road to try and go see a bear. He provides a quote from Key, reading, "My wife and daughter did not go far with us. We had gone a half mile or so when we heard an awful scream that sounded like someone in trouble. There was a stream there. As they approached the stream, one of Key's sons reportedly said, 'Look, Daddy, there's a bear.' But Harold went on to say that when he looked, it wasn't a bear, it was a man." He added that he didn't get a good look at him because he seemed to be trying to stay hidden behind bushes. Later in the article, Paulides writes, Key again explains the scream they heard. He described the sound they heard as one loud, long, painful scream. From here, Paulides goes on to say, "As a former 20-year law enforcement veteran, I'd like to know what transpired when the FBI interviewed Mr. Key away from the park, but it appears that we will never know. And according to him, this is because the FBI has refused my FOIA request for this case, and the NPS never wrote a report or failed to supply the report to my FOIA in regards to the interview with Mr. Key." For those who are perhaps not familiar with these American terms, FOIA stands for Freedom of Information Act, and it is the manner by which we are allowed to request documents from the government. A solid 30% of our audience is non-American now, so this feels like it might be a necessary inclusion. Basically, the way this works is that in the United States, if you want to know something about something the government recorded, any document they have, you simply file a request, and if that document does not pertain to national security or an ongoing criminal investigation, they are supposed to give it to you. Obviously, it is the government, so that doesn't always happen, and it doesn't always happen in a timely manner, but at least we have it. As for those other two acronyms, FBI is Federal Bureau of Investigation. That is the nation's top police force, the highest level police force that we have. And then, of course, NPS is National Park Service, which, ironically enough, is technically law enforcement as well. Actually, in the Stacey Aris case, if I'm not mistaken, they did use the fact that they are a law enforcement agency to deny requests for certain parts of the documents. And this was in the 2010s for a case that's been cold since, I think, 1982. Anyway, Paulides said he finds it nearly impossible that the National Park Service investigators never wrote a report about the interview with Mr. Key, and seems stunned that they wouldn't even go to the area and investigate. Papers reported that the area where the scream was heard was some 10 miles away from Spence Field, within a couple hours of the disappearance, and therefore, rangers found it very unlikely that it had anything to do with Dennis Martin. Whatever was said during that conversation between Jim Reich and Harold Key, the secrecy was enough for Dave to ask, what was it about the appearance of the subject that the Keys observed that caused their son to believe they were witnessing a bear? This was probably one of the most important developments in the disappearance of Dennis, he continues, and the National Park Service is claiming they never documented this interview. Unbelievable.
Inconceivable!
Thankfully, David Paulides was able to track down Bill Martin back in 2011, who, in the conversation they had, stated that he eventually got to speak with Mr. Key and was told things that you won't read in a newspaper, after Dave told him that he was familiar with the Key sighting. According to Paulides, it was at this point that Bill dropped a bit of a bombshell on him. Mr. Martin stated that the Keys had thought they saw a dark-figured man running along a ridgeline carrying something on his shoulder. Dave says he again asked Mr. Martin to explain what he just stated, at which point Bill again stated that the Keys had seen and later reported the sighting as a dark-figured man running along a ridge carrying something on his shoulder. Paulides asked Martin why the News and Park Service had never reported this information, but the latter could only say that he didn't know, prompting the former to ask if he felt things were being kept from him. This led to Bill hesitating and then telling Paulides that he felt the park superintendent was a mere figurehead, before pausing to contemplate once more. After a pause, Bill asked David, "Do you know Jim Reich?" Paulides did know of Jim Reich, confirming that he was the lead FBI agent on several of the missing children cases in the mountains around the time Dennis disappeared. And Dennis's father followed this up with a second question. Do you know he committed suicide? It seems that Paulides didn't. So the way this version of the narrative unfolds, it almost seems like Key saw something, told the authorities almost immediately, was taken aside by Agent Reich, and then went to the papers with an approved version of the story. But there is a problem. Actually, there are several problems. First of all, it seems that Paulides has his timeline a bit mixed up, as he wrote that Key did not know the boy was missing until the next day, and at that point he contacted authorities, which does not appear to be the case. The Bristol Herald-Courier issue for July 23, 1969, includes an article, a portion of which reads, "According to Key, he made no connection with the trouble scream and young Martin until about a week after the incident." Key added, "We talked about it as a family and decided not to say anything because so many crackpots call in about things like that." This is somewhat relevant to the issue of the encounter with Agent Jim Reich outside of the park, which occurred in July according to page 32 of the FBI documents obtained via a FOIA request that was submitted by author and detective Michael Bouchard. So far as I can tell, however, and I'll get into this a little bit more later in the video, it doesn't seem that Key ever actually did go to the authorities. They came to him after he went to the press. Like I said, there's more I want to say about that topic, but I'm saving that for later in the video, when I'll be talking about how utterly weird this case is, even once you debunk all of the nonsense. But perhaps the most important part of David's account of events is the claim that Key saw a dark-figured man running along a ridgeline carrying something on his shoulder not long after the scream was heard. The problem with this is one that Paulides actually addresses, which is that there is absolutely no mention of this in the National Park Service or the FBI files on this case. In fact, the National Park Service didn't mention the incident at all. That said, the National Park Service side of the investigation, which was the actual search and rescue effort, ended on June 29th, and it was the FBI who contacted Harold Key. So it makes sense that the FBI would have records of that interview and the National Park Service wouldn't. Now, regarding the FBI, I do think it's a little bit odd that there is apparently no documentation about the details of the conversation between those two men, but I don't necessarily find it odd that there was no mention of a dark-figured man carrying something over his shoulder on a ridgeline. I don't find that part odd because there seems to be no evidence that Key ever said anything of the sort beyond David Paulides' claim that he interviewed Bill Martin. Since Paulides did not record his interview with Martin, or at the very least did not share it, then we're going on his word, which for me is not enough to put this in the facts column. On the other hand, I don't feel like I have the evidence to call this a lie, either on the part of Paulides or of Martin. But I do find it necessary to emphasize how much of the narrative given in Missing 411 Eastern United States is simply inaccurate. For example, Paulides could have interviewed Harold Key himself and asked directly if what Martin said was true, but for some reason David believed the man died in 2010. Of course, 2010 is a year before the book was published, but it doesn't matter because Key was alive and well in 2010, and he lived until 2019. This is relevant because in 2016, Michael Bouchard sat down with Harold Key and his daughter and interviewed them. Unfortunately, Bouchard did not think to ask about this specific aspect of the case. Either way, Paulides also referenced the suicide of Jim Reich multiple times, even claiming that he asked Bill if he felt that the suicide had something to do with the cases of missing children. Bouchard, on the other hand, interviewed Jim Reich's son, who gave him a completely explainable reason why he committed suicide that he didn't include in the books, because people don't need to know it. In case I wasn't clear about it, Michael Bouchard wrote a couple of books on the disappearance of Dennis Martin, so he is definitely one of the people who's done a lot of work on this case. He has interviewed a lot of people. There's also the fact that Dave said, the Dennis Martin incident should be a case study every search and rescue commander reviews, and that the details of the search should be analyzed and understood for their effectiveness or lack of effectiveness. The only reason I bring this up is that the documents that he himself got released via a FOIA filing include a thorough analysis and review of search procedures for exactly that reason. To give David Paulides a little bit of slack on this, his book was published about 11 years before the FBI released all of these files in response to a FOIA request by Michael Bouchard. So some of the information just wasn't available to Paulides. Unfortunately, that does not account for some of the other things that he got wrong, which I believe are not the result of the aforementioned lack of information, but rather a severe case of confirmation bias at best. Towards the end of the Dennis Martin chapter, Paulides says that a major concern that I've developed over the years is what did FBI agent Jim Reich document that could be so damning 50 years after the event that our government cannot tell the public? In many cases, I'd actually say this is a good question because I don't trust the FBI as far as I can throw the corpse of J. Edgar Hoover. However, in this case, we now know what was in those files, and while a couple of them are redacted to the point of uselessness, overall they're pretty straightforward. It can't be said that Paulides is wrong about the FBI dropping the ball on the investigation and behaving strangely, though for the most part it comes across as being an issue of dismissiveness and not conspiracy. I think that Dave is getting at something else, and I think it's the same something that we've talked about a number of times as we've gone through these stories. As many of you are likely aware, the genesis of Missing 411 was a conversation David Paulides had with a National Park Service ranger, while Mr. Paulides was researching Bigfoot. That's not meant to be a dig, considering we've done our own videos on the topic. I just think it needs to be made very clear that David Paulides is the founder of North America Bigfoot Search, and I personally feel it bleeds into his Missing 411. In this story, it shows through quite a bit in his characterization, or I should say mischaracterization, of the Harold Key incident, in which he seems to have either invented or mixed up some very important details, as evidenced by the following quotes from his book. Mr. Key's son stated that he heard and observed a bear, which was later changed to his father saying that he saw a human. A bear? A bear normally walks on 4 feet, not 2. What was the difference in the sighting that changed the description? This next one is phrased a little oddly, bear with me. Martin again stated that the Keys had seen, then we have a parentheses, the paper originally stated that the son thought they heard or saw a bear, end parentheses, and later reported the sighting as a dark-figured man running along a ridge carrying something on his shoulder. And finally, the idea that a witness would mistake a hairy bear for a human doesn't make a lot of sense unless the human was very hairy or they were wearing a shaggy large coat. Most of this can be reasonably explained by the fact that the boys never actually said they saw a bear. They only said they heard a bear. So far as I can tell, the 2 children themselves never actually spoke to any newspaper, and the entirety of this story was given to the papers by Harold Key himself. As for the Martin interview, there's no way to corroborate that it even happened. In fact, Bouchard interviewed Bill Martin's widow, Violet Martin, and she said that she didn't recall Paulides ever having a conversation with her husband. The reason that I did not go into a ton of detail on that is it's possible she just wasn't home. I just don't think there's a way to prove or disprove whether this conversation ever happened. Anyway, all of that is relevant because of the way that Paulides went on to present the words of Dwight McCarter, whose book Lost, a Ranger's Journal of Search and Rescue, David frequently cites. I have a copy of that book and it's sitting on my desk at home, and I did read through it for this video. Paulides had better access to McCarter than I did though, and in October of 2011, he and another unnamed researcher approached McCarter at his home and asked if he wouldn't mind answering a few questions about his years of tracking, to which Dave says he responded, "Sure." The important part of that interview isn't given verbatim, but based on what I've read from McCarter and what Bouchard gleaned from his interviews with the man, I think it sounds reasonably believable, and I will read it for you. I asked Dwight why one of the children of the Keys would first state that he observed a bear and then his father stated they saw a man. Dwight hesitated for several minutes and then said that in and around the park there are wild men. He stated there is more than one. They are hairy, dirty, and one even had an old bearskin that he wore. Dwight was careful with his words, but did state that these men lived in the wild and were essentially living off the land in and around the park. I asked if he thought Dennis was taken by a wild man. He stated at the time he really gave it little thought. The only wild man he knew in the park at the time lived at the other end near the Cataloochee Valley and didn't venture into the area where Dennis disappeared or the area of Cades Cove at the bottom of Rowan's Creek. Dwight McCarter made it clear that these wild men he was speaking about were humans who decided to live in the wild. They had little contact with humanity and they appeared as the name implied, wild and unkempt. This was the first, last, and only time I have ever heard anyone mention wild men inside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. McCarter, for his part, would go on to clarify to Bouchard that he in no way meant that these were feral humans, just they were people who lived off-grid in the wild. The reason I bring this piece up is actually the very last sentence of the quoted section, because I want to point out how Paulides, who this whole time was harping on the alleged sighting of a man running through the forest carrying something over his shoulder, was dismissive of a ranger straight up telling him there are wild men. To pull a page from David's playbook, the only reason to suggest that it was a kidnapping, but not by humans, even the wild ones, is if you're trying to suggest it was something non-human. That's how Dave's logic frequently works. Except in this case, I actually think I'm making a decent point. Add to this the fact that Paulides repeatedly mischaracterized the Key incident as a bear sighting, all the while emphasizing that the only way to mistake a bear for a human is if that human is covered in hair. And all of this brings us to the issue of the Green Berets, who are the reason that I was skeptical about the official narrative on this case in the first place. But Paulides goes a bit beyond what I was willing to say, making an argument that the Green Berets weren't just acting alone, they were actually deployed to the specific area where Key said he'd seen the man. During his research, he says that it was discovered the Park Service closed Cades Cove Loop for 3 days without explanation. He claims this was just after the Key family made their observations, and that there is nothing in the documents he received explaining why the cove was closed. Thing is, the documents quite clearly state that the road was closed to keep unauthorized searchers and onlookers from getting into the search zone. This was both for their safety and for the integrity of the search. In any case, he says that one change in strategy could have altered the course of events in this SAR, that being to expand the perimeter once leaders understood that the Harold Key family had a viable sighting. Rather than searching the park from the inside out, he argues that they should have started 10 miles out from where Dennis was last seen into Cades Cove and search toward where he was last seen by the Key family. Paulides follows this up by saying he believes this is what actually happened and that this is the real reason Cades Cove was closed for 3 days. But as we established, the Park Service gave a valid and perfectly mundane reason for the closure. From here, he adds that the real question is, why wouldn't search and rescue commanders admit to having expanded the perimeter and to including Rowan's Creek and Sea Branch in the search area? I believe the Green Berets were given this task, he answers, and this is why they had special communications and did not interact with National Park Service radios, and why their helicopters were landing at the cove. While I'll grant that it is to some extent possible that Cades Cove was in fact closed for some sort of Black Ops tomfoolery, it's by no means the answer requiring the fewest assumptions, and it's based upon faulty information. I say that because this line of reasoning is dependent on one core assumption, that being Paulides' claim that Harold Key alerted authorities to what he had seen on June 15, 1969. All the evidence, however, indicates that Key did no such thing, the Bristol Herald Courier noting that he didn't really make any connection between the scream he heard and the disappearance of Dennis Martin for about a week. The Knoxville News-Sentinel issue for the 21st also clearly states that Key said he does not plan to tell the National Park Service or other authorities unless asked, so it's unlikely that he called the FBI. Paulides probably mixed this up because of another part of the article where it said that Key only learned of Dennis's disappearance the next day. And then the next line of the article says that he didn't associate the scream with Dennis for a week. If he didn't realize for about a week, that means that the very earliest he would have told anybody about this would be June 20th or 21st. Since the Green Berets were reportedly already in the Eagle Creek area by the 17th, there's no way anyone was acting in response to that tip. So with all of that said, I don't think it's reasonable to conclude that there's any real likelihood that Dennis Martin was kidnapped by Sasquatch. But the thing is, this case is weird enough without bringing Bigfoot into it. Ever since I first heard of it, I have felt like something was not quite right about the Dennis Martin disappearance. And this was in large part due to just how quickly he disappeared and the fact that nothing was found. But after doing the research for this episode, I came across a few other issues. As well documented as this search was, a few aspects of the narrative have left me scratching my head, such as the location where Harold Key reportedly saw that rugged-looking man, as it seems to change between the 21st and the 27th of July. The News-Sentinel article from the earlier date states that the group wanted to go back into the mountains to look for a bear, and that upon arrival in the cove, they got a map and asked where we could go in our car where there wouldn't be too many tourists. It does seem a little odd that a ranger would grant that kind of request, but Harold Key was working in the park and he had been staying in Gatlinburg, so it's possible that he knew the rangers a little bit better and was able to get special treatment. Or alternatively, he may have just not mentioned they were looking for a bear. In any case, the ranger directed them to a road that went way back into the mountains, which Key described as pretty rough. I didn't think I would ever come to a place to turn around. He then followed this road for what he said was 7 to 10 miles until he noticed a sign denoting the elevation as 5,000 feet. And while he didn't know for sure, he believed they were near Spencefield. I will say that one immediate issue here with Key's version of events is that Ranger Bob Morris told the Herald Courier that the only such sign in the park was 17 miles away from Spencefield. That said, it's possible this wasn't an official National Park Service sign, it may have been a sign about what was ahead, or he may have just misread a sign. On the other hand, it could be that Key had read about this story in the papers, some of which listed the location at which Dennis went missing as 5,000 feet, and either consciously or subconsciously inserted that into the story. Either way, it's clearly stated in the article that they parked the car on the side of the road where they noticed a white car, turned out to be a Chevy, was parked under some low-hanging branches. It was a 1958 to 1961 model, and while it was obscured, Key stated, "I wouldn't say it was hid, but it was pulled back into the woods." From the car, Key, his sons Jonathan and Anthony, and his daughter Wanda's boyfriend, who I believe is now her husband, a man by the name of Gary Grandstaff, walked up a creek bed for what he said was 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile. About this time, the group heard a blood-curdling scream, and while he couldn't tell exactly where it had come from, Key told the papers it sounded like it came from higher on the mountain to him. In Bouchard's second book on the disappearance of Dennis Martin, which I believe is simply called The Disappearance of Dennis Martin, it's sitting on my desk back at home, I don't have it in front of me, he wrote that during his 2016 interview with Key, the man told him that he'd heard a child scream, "Help," and that this was followed by another agonizing scream. Sorry, just another agonizing scream of pain. A few minutes after this, Key says that one of the boys told him he thought he heard a bear, and when Harold himself went to look to see where the bear might be, he saw a man behind some bushes across the creek. Key couldn't tell much about him because he was going down the creek towards the cars and was keeping behind the leaves. He was definitely trying to keep from being seen. Again, that is a quote from the News Sentinel article on the 21st. A minute or two after that sighting, Key said he became worried about his wife and daughter after seeing the strange actions of the man and started back towards the car. Harold Key did not investigate the scream itself, but he did think to check across the creek where he had seen that man, because he felt that he might be a moonshiner. After crossing the creek, he said that he found a piece of notebook paper where the man had been behind the bushes, and that the paper appeared to be a rough map. According to the News Sentinel, Key said it looked like it had been freshly dropped and had a road name drawn on it, but he could not remember what the name of the road was. In addition to that labeled road, it also had a portion reading camp area, but Key chose to leave the paper where he found it rather than taking it with him. Upon their return to their vehicle, they noticed that the white Chevy was now gone. And at this point, it occurred to Harold Key that the fastest route between where he'd seen the man and where the car was went right past his wife and daughter. Put together, this story suggests that Key drove 7 to 10 miles out of Cades Cove along an access road, stopped by a creek, hiked upwards a 1/2 mile, heard a child scream for help, encountered the strange man, and then went back to his car. The big thing missing from the narrative given on the 21st is a firm location. So I used a 1971 map of the park to try and determine what route Key might have followed, and quickly ran into a major problem with this story. If we take what Key said here, then it seems most likely that he went east out of Cades Cove along a road following West Prong Little River, meaning he was probably using the road that is now West Prong Trail, which leads out to Tremont. Should say, I haven't been able to confirm 100% that West Prong Trail was a road, but the map seems to imply that it was, since another thing that I know for a fact at the time was used as a road is using the same dash pattern as the West Prong Trail. I feel this is also supported by the fact that Assistant Chief Ranger Edward Widmer reportedly said it is possible Mr. Key was on a road which goes into the mountains above the Trement Jobs Corps camp, which was unnamed. In addition, the same July 21st article in the News Sentinel notes that Bill Martin, having spoken to Key, felt the man was likely out by Elkmont, which is the wrong distance but the right direction. I think that Martin was going based off of air miles while Key was talking about road miles. When Key led officials to the location on the 26th of July, however, that was not where he brought them. Instead, he took them to Rowan's Creek and Sea Branch, which is not only much closer to Cades Cove, but also in the other direction. When the story hit the papers on the 27th, Carson Brewer of the News Sentinel reported that the Keys had parked their car at around 6 p.m., walked 400 yards up Sea Branch, and then returned to their vehicle at 6:45 p.m. When Key originally spoke to the press, he told them that he couldn't be sure when the scream occurred, but said that he knew it couldn't have been earlier than 3:30 or later than 5:30 in the afternoon. He also gave a much more vague distance of 1/2 mile to 3/4, whereas on the 27th it was only 400 yards, which is closer to just 1/4 mile or a little over 355 meters for our non-imperial friends. Regarding the distance and direction, I find it odd that Key went from 7 to 10 miles along a rough unnamed road to under 2 miles along a paved road. I was able to confirm via an older News Sentinel article that Cades Cove Loop, the road that Key would have used to get to Sea Branch, was paved at least as early as 1961, so he wasn't talking about Cades Cove Loop on the 21st. In addition to that, he should have at least been able to tell people on the 21st whether he'd gone east or west. 21st seems to imply he went east. So why then did the story change 6 days later, and could it have anything to do with him being intercepted by FBI agent Jim Reich, as Bouchard said he was? The FBI is who set up this meeting. Reich knew that Harold Key was on his way to the park, so the only reason to intercept him would be to speak to him privately in person before he reached the park. And that's important because at this point, the FBI was investigating. While the Bureau repeatedly informed the press that they had not entered the search, it's clear from the documents released by that FOIA request that they were following up on leads and had been in meetings with the National Park Service, specifically Chief Ranger Lee Sneddon, as early as June 18th. My question is, if Dennis was never found and there was no evidence of foul play, why did the FBI fight not just David Paulides, but also Michael Bouchard on releasing this data half a century later? Why did it take 3 requests and 1 letter explaining that they can't just use the exclusionary rule like that for these files to see the light of day? But those aren't my only questions, because there's at least 2 other loose ends that need to be tied up. The first being the strangely isolated activities of the Green Berets. I want to know why the Green Berets were so concentrated in the area that they were, while the Park Service seemed to be directing all other search traffic to the other side of the ridge. I would also like to know why the National Park Service did not launch a full investigation after Dwight McCarter was informed that somebody had come across some child's remains in the park in 1972. According to McCarter, he received this report in 1985, and the reason that it was so much later is because his informant was hunting ginseng and did not want to be arrested for doing so. Part of the reason I find that so intriguing is that McCarter was told the bones were found near Big Hollow. And Big Hollow is just over a ridge from the area I believe was being described by Harold Key on the 21st. I also find it interesting that rather than using National Park Service resources, Dwight McCarter brought in the Swain County Rescue Squad and a team of 30 men to search the Big Hollow area in 1985. It is also intriguing that McCarter's group didn't find anything when they went to do this, but then again, the source was a ginseng poacher who 13 years later told a National Park Ranger about it. Could have got the area a little bit off. I mean, the only evidence he gave them was it was near the roots of a big fallen tree, and I would assume there were probably at least a few of those in the park. For McCarter's part, he told Bouchard that after nearly 15 years, the foliage was too thick to find Dennis if he was there at all. To be honest, there are so many more aspects of this case that I could have gone through. I did not have the time. This is one of the most complex, convoluted things I've ever looked at, and for something that has so much documentation, good lord is it incoherent. Definitely when I am finished with this and I have a chance to sort of format everything in a more, well, I should say a less esoteric format that only I would understand, I will be putting it up onto the Patreon, and feel free to have at it, take a whack at it, see if you can figure out what happened, or if you think I missed anything, if you think that there's something I should have noted, please let me know. It's going up there. If you're wondering how you can get access to it, well, everything that we put up on Patreon, it's accessible for $1, and it's just patreon.com/thelorelodge. So if you want to support us, that's a great way to do it. But what I want to kind of conclude this video with is I just feel like something's not right with this case. I don't know where to point the finger, but I do strongly believe that somebody is hiding something. And while I'm very curious about who, I'm more intrigued about why. If you think you have any ideas, please let us know in the comments. We do read them, we do respond to quite a few of them, and there have been a number of occasions where somebody has left something in the comments that has led to us finding something and completely changing our minds. I also, in our Discord, which you can get to by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge, I've recently started using that to sort of crowdsource help with things like, for example, researching for this video, there was a document that was a handwritten letter, but it had been scanned in a way that was very difficult to read. So I just posted the screenshots and asked my Discord, hey guys, can you help? It worked. I've been doing it with a few other things now. We're just crowdsourcing investigative efforts. That said, I do want to be clear that even when I do that, I take the same critical eye that I take with any other source and make sure that I'm not just believing what people tell me. But the point is that if you want updates for the channel and all that, you should join the Discord, because we're in there, we do things, and you should also comment if you have thoughts on this case. You can also support us directly. You can do so by going to patreon.com/thelorelodge and joining for just $1, or you can join as a member here on YouTube. The only difference is that if you join at the higher tiers on YouTube, you don't get cool things like mugs and shirts like you do on Patreon. What you do get on both is access to our monthly Liquored Lore show. We have not done one for this month, and I have yet to post the one from last month, so I guess the one from last month is the one for this month. Huzzah. If you'd like to support us less directly, you can drink and wear us. And the way that you can drink the Lodge is by going to tableauroastingco.com, clicking on the Collaborations tab, and ordering Mount Pocono Perk, our signature coffee. I designed it myself. I was a barista for many moons, working at an artisan roastery. I know coffee. If you'd like to wear the Lodge, then you can do so by going to bunkerbranding.com and simply finding our section. We have a few designs. 2 of them are brand new. 2 of them are reimagined old ones, and I think you're gonna like all of them. They're also so cozy, like they are comfy shirts. If you would like more Lodge, you can get that by checking out our podcast, which airs Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern and goes live on Spotify, Apple, all the other podcasting platforms. Still Tuesday? Probably not still Tuesday. Probably Wednesdays. Wednesday mornings at like 5 a.m. It'll be up and ready to go. We haven't rebranded that yet, but it will be rebranded to the Lore Lads. For now, it's the Lore Lodge official podcast. You can also check out our other channels. We have the History Hut, which we're working on bringing a podcast back for. We have the Lore Lounge. We have the Weird Bible, which has a podcast, but is beholden to Wendigoon's schedule. If you know anything about Wendigoon, you know that is a busy schedule. As it stands, however, I think we have like 16 or 17 episodes up, and some of them are 4 hours long, so there's plenty of content. What else? I also have my own personal streaming channel, which is Aiden Mattis. It is https://youtube.com/@theaidenmattis, just like my Instagram and my TikTok. And over there, you can find gaming streams, reaction streams, some music streams. PJ and I recorded a couple songs of an album on there. And of course, we have 2 brand new channels that are hosted by not me. Those are Off the Record with Luke Eccles and Boozy Mixologist, which has its own podcast called Last Call Lounge. Off the Record also has a podcast. It's called Off the Record. And honestly, one thing that would be a huge help to us would be if you guys go watch those, and if you don't like them at all, that's cool. Just, go, you do you. If you do like them, or you think you could like them, however, please let us know how the shows could improve. Let us know what you like. Let us know who you'd like to see as a guest, and we can try and make it happen. All right, I think that is everything. I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.